Welcome, everybody. This is the second in the series of ACSI Best Practices webinars. This one we're focusing on monitoring and corrective action. And again, we're recording this one as well. So for other folks who weren't able to attend today, and for those of you who may want to listen to this again, you'll have the opportunity, and we'll put the recording and the PowerPoint slides in the Director's Digest that will go out to all of you tomorrow. I do want to let you know that, Kyle, everyone is unmuted. Is that correct? Okay, so that we have unmuted you from our end, so that we want to make sure that you mute yourself from your end so that we don't get any interference. Okay, let's get started. So today, these are our presenters. We have Andy Gruwell from Minnesota, Matt Fitzgerald from Virginia. We have Kathy Skoglund from South Dakota. And then, of course, I will be just doing the introduction, and then Kate Blunt will be specifically talking about the ACSI results in relation to corrective action and monitoring. So our goal today is to provide you with some best practices about what states have been doing regarding monitoring and corrective action. And specifically, we're going to be covering some of these areas. So we're talking about consistency of monitoring across the state, adherence to the established monitoring plan for on-site visits. We're also going to be talking about the usefulness of monitoring visits and clarity of feedback provided in the monitoring report. And I know some of our presenters are also going to be talking about the timeliness of feedback provided in the monitoring report and about the clarity of the state's corrective action and quality improvement plan process. The agenda for this afternoon is we're going to do an overview of the best practices work group. Kate is going to talk about the ACSI and continuous improvement. And then we're going to have our presenters, Matt, Kathy, and Andy, talk specifically, as I mentioned, about monitoring and corrective action. And then at the end, we'll have time for your questions and any of your thoughts and comments. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the best practices overview of our work group. And the purpose of the work group, we've been meeting back in May, I think our first meeting was, and we started meeting based on, these were the states who scored well based on the 2015 ACSI. So what we wanted to do was to share examples and approaches and strategies used by the state offices, and we went through each of the areas that were scored by the ACSI. And those of you who were on the first webinar, these are the states that were made up the best practices work group. So these were the states that scored in the top 5 in one of the areas. So it's not that every state scored in the top 5 in each of the areas. It just had to be one of the areas. So as you can see, we had Somia at California, Sarah with Colorado State Office, Dawn and Jerry joined us with Idaho, Adrian in Illinois, Bill Brand in Iowa, Doug Wallace in Kansas, and then today I mentioned that Andy is here from Minnesota, and we had Jennifer in Nebraska, Gary from Nevada, Kathy is with us today from South Dakota, Sarah Phillips with Vermont, Matt is a presenter today with Virginia, and then also Katie Castern with the state of Wisconsin. And what we did, as I mentioned, we first met as a full group. What we decided to do from there is to establish subgroups. So what we did is we established subgroups in each of those areas that were assessed with the ACSI, and obviously monitoring and corrective action was one of those. So each of the subgroups met to share examples and approaches and strategies that resulted them scoring very high in that particular area. And then other of the state offices in the whole entire work group were welcome to attend those those subgroups if they wanted to listen in on what the conversation was. And then from there, we decided that we wanted to, and this was sort of the point of it from the beginning, is for those state offices to share their experiences and their approaches and best practices, but then to share it with the network. So the first thing we did is we did a conference session at our conference in September, and that was specifically around linkages and communication. So we in some ways we replicated that session that we did at the conference at our first webinar that we had last week. So we weren't able, obviously, to be able to address all the areas at our conference. So the webinar series has been our opportunity and the state's opportunity to share with you their strategies and examples and best practices in each of the areas scored by the ACSI. So as I mentioned, this is our second in the series, and we're having 3 more, and we'll show you the dates at the end of this webinar, and those 3 are going to take place next month in January. That being said, I am going to turn it over to Kate Blunt, and she's going to talk about the ACSI in relation to continuous improvement. So welcome, Kate.
Jackie. So I'll give you a few minutes just to give a context for what we're doing, sort of data points and some information, so we all are starting on the same page. So when you look at this slide, this is about continuous improvement, which is what all of this is about, why we're using the ACSI and the impact that it might have in terms of the network. So OCS is using the ACSI to help it and the states focus on continuous improvement efforts to become more effective in each of the areas that were surveyed. And you saw that list, and we'll look at that in a minute. And all of those are tied, as you know, to the state accountability measures, to the federal accountability measures, and the state accountability measures is those are reported in your state plans. So continuous improvement, as you know, requires you to start measuring where you are. To improve, you have to know where you're starting from and getting customer feedback so you make sure that what you change, in fact, meets customer needs. So the ACSI methodology really provides you with some data and some comments, provides the state with that information that can be used to focus change efforts in your particular state. The goal with continuous improvement, you measure, you get customer feedback, you make the changes, and then you measure again. So back in 2015, we did that first survey. We're able to see where we are, met with this group, come up with some best practices, be able to provide you all with some information. Hopefully you'll be able to use some of this to make some changes, and then we'll measure again. The next survey won't happen again until 2019. So this is a continuous cycle, and hopefully it will mean that everybody will have improved scores and improved operations. Next, Jackie. You can see the good news is that clearly many states took the continuous improvement challenge very seriously. You can see that the CSI improved from 65 to 71, and every single, in terms of the satisfaction, the expectations, and satisfaction compared to the ideal improved. This was largely driven by 14 states who significant increase in their CSI scores from 2015 to 2017. So this is what drove the national increase of 6 points. Jackie, this is the model for the 2017 survey. You'll see the 7 areas that were surveyed that are in blue. Scores for each of those areas along the left-hand side, with communication monitoring scoring the highest, and impacts for those on the yellow squares 1.6, 9.8, communication still having the highest impact. All of the driver scores went up from 2015, which is a very good. Let's focus now more specifically on the monitoring. Next slide, Jackie. One. Okay, so what we're talking about today is the monitoring and corrective action. So the survey data, just to, again, bring you all to the same page. This is an impact of 0.9, which is a significant enough impact to pay some attention. The score generally went up from 69 to 74, a good result. And every single area that asked all the questions, adherence to the plan, clarity, usefulness, consistency of monitoring also went up, which excellent signs. Clarity of the process was the thing that got the most bump up. So whatever the states are doing to try to make things more clear. It is to be noted, and why we're talking about best practices today, that states ranged a great deal on this. Many states scored in the 80s and 90s. One scored in 95, but some states scored 20s and 30s. So there's plenty of room for improvement. Next slide, Jackie. I just want to give you, this is sort of a summary of some of the comments that we received in the survey. Probably that middle one summarizes some of it. Spending time with the local agency to better understand the needs and challenges of the community served, as opposed to it being more of an auditing process. Explore with the local agency potential resources to strengthen their services and connect them to other peers in the state. View the relationship as a partnership and not just from a compliance standpoint. To sort of lay out some thinking about what the relationship might be. And then the whole thought about timeliness and sharing time frames, providing constructive, realistic feedback. So there were a number of comments that fell within the type of relationship created around monitoring and the whole timeliness and process of it. So with that, one more slide. Things that CFI group who conducted the survey, some of the suggestions that they made based on what they did in the comments. I put these up here. These are some of the things you might hear about today. But it is something that everyone can pay attention to that did come out of some of the comments. A lot of it had to do with standardizing some things, making sure that the monitors are trained, being able to share best practices, that kind of a thing. So with that, I'd like to turn it over. Next slide. Who are we starting with? Andy in Minnesota. That's great. The great state of Minnesota. So Andy, give a whirl.
All right. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andy from Minnesota. We're part of the Department of Human Services. Yeah, here's a little overview of CSBG in Minnesota. We have 33 eligible entities, so all of our community action agencies are private. We have 24 of those, and also serve 9 tribal grantees. We currently have 3 action assigned grant managers located in the Office of Economic Opportunity, which is part of the Minnesota Department of Human Services. And allocation is comprised of both federal and state funding. So it's about $8.5 million a year for CSG, and then we also have a companion Minnesota Community Action Grant. There's a little over half of what we get federally at this point. And discretionary funds go to the state office to be used for a number of items, technical, training technical assistance, our support our state association, a number of other activities as well. So one thing, I thought I'd start just with 3 things that we really need to focus on. Even before ACSI, these were 3 things that we really found useful with our grantees. Partnership, usefulness, and ongoing monitoring. So I'll first talk a little bit about partnership. We kind of look at it as a way to develop relationships between the grantee, between state office staff, agency staff, local partners, board members. So that's really the focus. That's how we focus the meeting as we start it. We have a set of guiding principles for partnership, and we actually print this out. We send it ahead of time to everyone who's going to be meeting with us during the visit. And we start out the meeting by actually talking through these 5 things and defining them. We ask that the group we're meeting with holds us accountable to these principles for partnership, and we hold them accountable too. Kind of just a good way to set the mood for the meeting. and it seems to have worked for us up to this point. The other thing we do a lot is we offer to observe, go to a board meeting for observation or training. We have a separate form that we use when we go to observe a board meeting. We like to introduce ourselves. We like to let them know who we are, put a face to our name. We know that our contract is with the board and that we're open to communication with the board directly if they feel like that's something they want to do. We offer training at that point. Usually leave a card with them. Try and do that maybe every 2 or 3 years when we're out. We will offer to do that or more as needed if they ask us to come and join the board on anything. We did that a lot with org standards. And so it seems to help because then we get to know the board a little bit better, and the board feels more comfortable with who we are as a funder and understands our role. The second piece that we really focus on is the usefulness, and we look at it as usefulness for the grantee and us. So we want to make sure that the visit is more than just checking boxes and making sure there's compliance. We make sure that there's training involved or communication is developed or relationships are developed. One of the ways we do this is through checklists that we've developed. Some things are actually new that we'll be implementing for the first time this fiscal year. For the checklist for site visits, we really that ensures accountability and consistency. So we have time frames. We like to notify the grantee within a certain amount of time. Make sure that scheduling is easy. We usually give a range of dates and have the grantee let us know which date would work best and what time frame is the best. We like to make sure that when the report due, we have it. We let them know at the visit you should expect this report within a certain amount of time. Kind of just accountable. We want to make sure that we're consistent across the network too. This is good for reporting as well. We have a nice kind of put everything checklist along with the report and materials from the monitoring visit we put together along with an agenda. And I like to send out like a tentative agenda and have the grantee modify that if they think there's anything they'd like to focus on or if there's any training that they need. The thing too that we try to do is actually go out to each grantee about once a year. So sometimes that's more of a training visit, sometimes it's more of a monitoring visit. We'll go more if necessary. Minnesota is a pretty big state, traveling by car, but we make an effort to get out there. But we are required, because of our state funding, we need to go at least once every biennium or every 2 years. So most of our grantees fall above the funding threshold that we're required to visit every year. But there are a lot that we tend to go to once a year just for training purposes as well. Recently, we've also hired a consultant to work with some of our tribal grantees. So this is somebody who can help with communication, trust building. As she gets a little bit more familiar with community action, she can provide TNTA and someone who kind of is able to be on site at a lot of our tribal grantees more often than we are. And we go out for monitoring. That person will also come out and be at the table with during certain parts of the agenda their grantees. And this piece is really the ongoing monitoring. We kind of look at monitoring as being something that isn't a certain date. That's a requirement, but we like to also just have monitoring be something that we do throughout the year. That through regular communication and relationships. Here at EO, we have a number of grants. We have some SNAP grants and housing and homelessness grants and things like that. So a lot of our community action agencies also have grants through different program managers or different grant managers. So they get a lot of touch points with our office. And so talk a lot here back in St. Paul where the state office is located, and I'm sure that staff at the agency talking about OEO after come and go. But we try to make sure that we coordinate site visits so we're not there at the same time, or we're not back-to-back weeks or months. Kind of stagger our site visits. I think just considerate of the fact that a small grantee, like a fiscal director, needs to take a lot of time off some of our visits to do fiscal reconciliation and talk through internal controls and things, and then miss a couple days of the regular job back-to-back would be a burden. So we try to make sure that we consider of that. The other thing we do is talk with other departments or agencies. For example, LIHEAP is not part of the Department of Human Services in Minnesota, but we still communicate with Department of Commerce, which administers LIHEAP in Minnesota. A lot of our shared grantees ensure that if there's anything that we need to have on the agenda, we make sure that we talk about those things when it's appropriate. And, just for correction, which happens time to time, we try to make sure that there's a real consistent time frame that we them to and they hold us to as well. So we like them to be able to correct the item, to be on a path to correcting the item, but we like to pair that with resources and training. So sometimes we'll go out and do a quick or do a webinar with the board or with staff a month after we're out there in person. Make sure that they understand what the issue is and that they know where to go from the area of deficiency. Usually it's pretty well. We also communicate with the board a lot for correct action, so that I make sure that it's understood by not just staff but the board as well. And I think that's about all I had for today.
All right, terrific. Thank you, Andy. And if any of you have questions for Andy, we're just going to ask you to hold them, write them down, remember them, and hold them to the end just so we can make sure that Matt and Kathy also get a chance to present. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt Fitzgerald in the state of Virginia.
Thank you, Jackie. Good afternoon. My office in Virginia is actually located within the huge agency, Virginia Department of Social Services, but then within the Division of Community Volunteer Services, and it's called the Office on Volunteerism and Community Services. It has 31 agencies. We have 22 privates, 6 publics, and we have 3 statewide organizations that serve all over the state and primarily within our other community action agencies. Programs run through those agencies. 4 staff that are primarily with CSBG, not exclusively, but primarily. Overall, for the state, we receive probably $1 million. 5% of that goes to admin. Our 5% discretionary actually goes to those 3 statewide organizations that I was talking about. So this is the quick list. This is what I'm going to go over. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our process where we developed and used a monitoring task force to revise all of our monitoring policies. Talk about the way that our state has chosen to use designated agency representatives from our office, so people that work directly with agencies and are tasked with them, their specific agencies. A little bit about some of what is kind of our monitoring processes, which is breaking up visits a little bit and doing board interviews in a different way. A little about our consistency with regard to the different materials that we have, that we've done to improve our pre-monitoring or improve our pre-monitoring process. So we use monitoring letters and a really heavy emphasis on providing recommendations rather than focusing strict compliance. And we address any findings or corrective action with a detailed work plan that allows for plenty of time for the activities to be completed. In the monitoring processes, our state, up until a year and a half ago, was a kind of a standard 3-year monitoring cycle for all of our agencies. So visits were only scheduled with no discussion of what agencies' needs were or possible concerns. It was just standard 3-year for everyone. So based on a couple of things, one being new uniform guidance coming out that talked about assessments. We had a risk assessment, but it was very simple. Just our overall office strategic planning, where we had talked about the need to show a little bit of what we do to better cover the state with monitoring. We decided that we probably needed a new risk assessment, and we might want to have some kind of process to identify whether or not agencies needed to be everything, or if there was reason to do them earlier. So in order to do that, since it was going to be a radical change, we would create a task force. So we created a task force of all agency staff and worked over a period of almost a year, reviewing all the documents that we had previously, and then coming up with recommendations for documents for the new process, including publics, which is always an issue for us, the differences between the two, and coming up with a brand new risk assessment. So we did all that work with this task force and came up with new documents and a new process, then put forward to the state plan and comment periods, and were finally approved by all our agencies. Next. That we do, we have agency representatives, so staff are assigned agencies, and they have those agencies for monthly calls, which is a conversation with the agency every month. Sometimes it's an email if it's not as much to be discussed, but it basically means that we have constant contact with the agencies. And what has allowed us to do is we develop a technical assistance plan. We follow that through, and through that, develop the technical assistance training plan and the discussions in those monthly calls, we have a really good idea way in advance of monitoring of the things that might be issues. So agency representative works with the agency in advance of monitoring to ensure they're as prepared as possible. This goes on with what Andy was saying about it's very much of a partnership, and we use that relationship that's built for the months of talking about every single thing that is on an agency to plan and work towards the monitoring. We process where it was almost 3 days that we were going out for every monitoring, and it involved, we had a bunch of interviews, staff, management and board, and we had, file review, everything else. So we came up with, and we were also going out every year just for a board meeting, at least one board meeting every year where we go out and just sit at the board meeting and listen and participate a little bit, mainly just to observe. So we broke up our monitoring now so that we do the board view along with a board meeting on an entirely separate day, a day where there is a board meeting scheduled, separated entirely from the overall monitoring. So it's reduced that we're in their office. We're usually on site 1 to 1.5 days now, and then the board meeting, that. But we just basically meet with the board, our interview right before the meeting, and then we're there for the meeting. So that really reduces some of the burden on staff to prepare for us and have us in their office for multiple days. It has kind of helped us to board interview more useful because we conduct an interview and then we actually are there for the meeting, so we can kind of see the cross reference between what the decision is on how morning meetings are held and what occurs there and their actual occurrence. Worked to try to develop as much consistency as possible in materials. So when we had our task force, all the checklists, we already had checklists that existed, but all those existing checklists were reviewed and vetted by that task force. And looking for consistency in what we were saying and asking and the overall policies that we had in place, what they understood our office's expectations to be. So that was helpful to us to make sure that what we were monitoring on was consistent with what agencies believed, we thought, and were planning to address. We also send out our materials to the agencies in advance. They're actually on our website. You can them at any time. We had to ask agencies, not to prepare them in advance, though, because that for interviews and things like that, it kind of defeats the purpose a little bit. So that has been a challenge, I will say. Also I'm mentioning that there's 3 levels of the interview process. So we talk to staff, management, and board in monitoring a little bit at different times since we do the board meeting several times. And then come out to a monitoring. This is consistent, again, with what Andy was talking about. So we do an intro meeting where we talk about what our guiding principles are for monitoring so that agencies are aware, and this is in our policies anyway, so they can read them at any time, but this kind of sets the tone at the beginning of the meeting that this is an attempt to understand the agency's needs and weaknesses so that we get them with technical assistance and training, not so that we can get a letter full of really terrible things that will look bad, although, there are things that go in letters sometimes. And then at the end of every monitoring, a full exit interview with all the leadership to go over everything that's going to be in the letter in detail so that they're fully aware of what's going to come out. Something that we have developed, and this came from our task force too, we're doing, as I was saying, 3s and all the interviews and all that. So instead of doing the staff interview, which was not super productive because a lot of staff were sitting together in a meeting room and wanting to share necessarily their thoughts because they had their coworkers there and super productive. So the survey, just a survey monkey survey, and we send that out to staff in advance, guarantee and not share it with anyone at the agency, no leadership or anything like that. We take the results and summarize them, helpful to share with in that way, but we didn't share any of the individual results. That survey piece that's separate now, and then we developed a pre-monitoring checklist that we send out 30 days in advance of the monitoring. It's a lot of different documents that we would review on site that we're able to either receive prior or they already have submitted to them maybe for org standards or things like that, and they just that pre-monitoring checklist, and we review many things in advance. I'll just give you one example. For like publics that have sub-grantees, we might get a sampling of sub-grantee contracts in advance and review those prior. So that also reduces some of the on agencies, and I think their attention at the visit, because we've already reviewed a lot of things and given them feedback before we even show up. Our letters have 3 areas. They're findings, concerns, and recommendations. Probably a lot of others. The findings are really things that are specific regulatory violations or legal bylaws violations. And of course, those are things that rise higher on the list and have to be dealt with immediately, because being things that we dealt with and expect a response and some kind of action taken on them, but they're really to catch something in advance of it being a problem and work through it. But the letter that really is the heaviest focus, we do a full recommendations where we take everything we've talked about in the interviews and things that we've seen and a list of things that we think would help to improve so you could avoid concerns and findings. And those things then result in change at the agencies without us having to ask them to. They're very happy to get that feedback, and it's definitely the most popular part of our visits for sure. So we do have the occasional corrective action plan. If we have findings, we definitely have some kind of corrective action plan. And there are definitely some things that require immediate action, but in general, we work through that same process I was talking about with the agency-assigned representatives to then have that monthly contact where you're now setting out a plan to deal with that issue that was found in monitoring in collaborative fashion with finding resources for you and helping you to understand a better way to deal with that situation in an ongoing fashion instead of, I need this in 15 days or there's going to be some kind of specific action. Now, I won't say there's nothing that ever comes up that doesn't require immediate action, but in general, it's very collaborative. Is that the one I think?
Yes, it is.
Yep.
Okay, all right, terrific. Thank you very much, Matt. And again, if you have questions for Matt, make sure you write them down, and we can talk about them at the end. And now we're going to turn it over to Kathy Skoglund from South Dakota. Hello, Kathy.
Hi, thanks everyone for participating this afternoon, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we do here. We have 4 community action agency only. They are all private. I am the only staff person, and I work in this program half-time. I have another responsibility. I am located in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Our state capital is in Pierre, and that's 227 miles away, which creates some interesting advantages and disadvantages. I'm located in the Department of Social Services in the Division of Economic Assistance. You can see the budgetary allocation. We do allocate 5% for administration. Usually don't use that much, and it goes back to the agencies at the same percentage that they otherwise get. Other funds, the discretion funds also are allocated separately. We're asking the agencies to use that for emergency services. There are 4 tribal entities plus 1 shared tribal entity with North Dakota that receive funding directly from OCS. Next slide, please. It's done annually with only 4 agencies. It's important, I think. These are really large organizations and have sub-offices covering anything from 14 to 20 counties. So it's important, I think, to at least visit with them annually. And I'm responsible for that program monitoring. The DFS Office of Finance and Procurement does the financial monitoring. So I communicate with them, and they do as the organizational standards related to finance, along with a lot of other things, that feedback from them and share my feedback properly with them. Next slide, please. The monitoring tools annually, at least tweak them, and it's because of my own desire to not do exactly the same thing every time. So I tweak them, add some things that I haven't looked at before. I just do a different kind of a document sometimes. But I always send it to them in advance so that they have it and know what I'm going to be covering. I usually do all the visits in the summer just because of the schedule with my other work. That works best, and the agencies seem to feel like that's a good time for me to come as well. The visits are scheduled with input from the agencies after the document is sent. I call them and we negotiate a time. And really the focus of the visit is teamwork, respect. I listen to their input. It's open communication. Typically take 1 to 2 days. The documentation that they submit to me can be in paper format. It can be in a flash drive. They can send it to me email, however it really works for them. Following the visit, I provide a completed draft document to the agency within 30 days, and they have opportunity to offer corrections or additions. If something was missing, some paperwork or a format or something was missing at the time I do the on-site, they've got that 30 days to send it to me, and I'll just accept it as if they did exactly when I was there. For example, there have been times when the latest board minutes had not been approved yet by the board of directors, and then they send them to me, or they're in the process of updating a board roster or something, and so I might get that just a little bit later. The correction or additions that they submit will be considered, but they may not be accepted. You know, they have a different view than I do, and so there have been times when I've said no for this reason, standing the way it is, and we're going to need to, you'll need to respond to it in that manner. They know by the end of the visit if there are any issues that they will be needing to address within the 30-day period or beyond. Next slide, please. So after that 30 days and their review and their feedback back, then the monitoring document is finalized. If there are any findings, a letter is sent with the final document with findings signed, and a technical assistance plan is offered. I also offer recommendations or options in the letter if that's appropriate for me to do so, or I have some options that I'm aware of that might work. I would follow IM 116 and through I would need to. I never needed to go beyond the technical assistance plan. So the agency corrects within 60 days. No further action is taken, and a letter is sent accepting their correction. If they respond with a plan to correct within 30 to 60 days, and a technical assistance plan is created with monthly follow-up. So they monthly report to me, and I always ask that just a paragraph be added, and then once that's all complete, if they successfully complete or correct, I'll send a letter letting them know that has occurred. As I said, I've never needed to do a quality improvement plan date. Next slide, please. Basically, our overall philosophy is that monitoring is not an adversarial situation. At the beginning of the visit, I asked them to be prepared to talk about programs or issues or communities or the news and goods. What's news from your area and what good is happening, so that they have an opportunity to have an unstructured conversation with me. I take notes in that and sometimes put that a summary of that discussion at the end of the document, so that they know that I was listening, and it helps me to, and I'm preparing to do next year's review, to just, oh yeah, we were talking about, or how'd that go, or whatever. And last October, and people maybe have heard me say, with the 4 agencies, we lost 2 of our longtime directors in 6 weeks. Both had cancer. We had 32 and 40, up to 46 years of experience in community action among our 4 directors. So they have lots of knowledge to share with me, and I always took advantage of those opportunities to spend time with them. So we have one agency still working with an interim director, and the other has a new director on board. And I've since December that director died, I've been doing monthly telephone calls just to try to coach and to assist in any way that I can. And the agencies are doing really well. I also end the meeting with an opportunity for them to offer any information that they would want to, or, oh, I forgot to tell you about, and we spend some time talking at them too as our wrap-up. Again, not adversarial. I can't do any work in CSPG without them, and they really need our funding as well. So it's a mutual need situation. Next slide, please. So monitoring is generally one piece of frequent communication. They do a monthly report to me, and I do a report to them, and that easily may result in a follow-up call either way. They do monthly financial requests. We do phone conferences as needed. We do email as needed. I usually do at least one other visit, and sometimes 2. I try to visit the board at least every 1 to 2 years. For some time, I've always been asked to do a training piece when I come in, whether it be on just a little on the background of CSBG, to I've used the theory of change. We've talked a little bit about Roma. We've just covered a lot of different kinds of topics when I'm there. And the annual association conference also, there's a session where I just have an opportunity to respond to questions. I usually have a few things prepared to share with them, but again, very, very informal, and open communication is really what we try to do. That's really all I have to share with you. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kathy. You can see on your screen here is Andy, Matt, and Kathy's information. So if you wanted to reach out to them specifically, you have their email addresses as well as their phone numbers. So you can make sure you can keep that information. But if you have any questions now, it would be great for you to ask. And I'm looking at the window, and it looks like we received a couple of comments, so I will go through those. So you're all unmuted as well, so if you have questions, then please feel free to ask. And if this is to anyone in particular, what's the average allocation for a grantee? And then the follow-up question is, does frequency of monitoring vary by grantee size or complexity? So each have you answer that, if you can respond to that. And can we start with you, Matt, because I know you've talked about your risk assessment that you've just recently completed.
The allocation is, we do an allocation formula, and it's based on the number of localities served, the percentage of poverty in the area, and the general size of the area served. So the allocations are all over the place size-wise. We do have a minimum allocation too, though. And I mean, I can send anyone that would like to see it our allocation formula. It's set in code. Second piece, and I didn't go very well into this actually. So I was mentioning that we have a risk assessment, and yeah, that risk assessment it's very detailed and has a lot of questions that are specifically around what was asked, size of agency, complexity of programs, things like that, potential risk. And so we do determine a risk number based on that risk assessment, and then 1, 2, or 3 year monitoring based on that. We currently have nobody that's on the 1 year list, but we do have a couple that are on the 2 year list.
Okay, thanks, Matt. What about you, Andy?
You know, we have a formula with a base amount, a 3-tiered base amount as well. So just doing some quick math here, the average is about $360,000 or so per grantee. We have 33 grantees. We have the state funding as well. So, and this, what was the second question? I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. The second question is, does the frequency of monitoring vary by grantee size or complexity?
Yeah, so because we have state funding, we are required to monitor every 2 years with state biennium funding. Most of our grantees, and then there's a threshold. If they fall above 250, we need to be here every year. So most of our grantees are above 250. A lot of our tribal grantees and some of our smaller community action agencies, we aren't required to go every year, but I think I said earlier too, we often will go if the area, because we're out in that corner of the state. Sometimes we'll stop in and do a training or do part of a month visit so that we can do the other parts later. So we generally try and go to every agency every year, but there are exceptions.
Okay, thanks. And Kathy?
Well, with agencies, and again, they're covering large service areas, look at the number of people living in at 125% poverty and below in that service area compared to the total number in the state. And so they range from about 460,000 to 1,023,000. The average of that is around 725,000. We do a risk assessment in concert with the contracting responsibility each year, and that's really with contracts, and we are the ones who develop that and have us do that. And I left out a piece. Can you help me?
No, you answered the first question about allocation, and then the second one was about your frequency of monitoring, and does that vary by grantee size or complexity?
Well, I visit every agency every year, so nope.
Yeah.
didn't give the allocation number. So we basically, it goes from 160,000 as the lowest to about $1 million.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you. And before, there's another question also, so be thinking about questions on your end. But the question is, if you are visiting grantees annually, which most of you are, how are you keeping them abreast of changes in ROMA, reporting, etc.? And then when are you monitoring for compliance with the organizational standards? Kathy, do you want to take that first?
Sure. When I visit, the monitoring tool that I've developed has embedded in it the org standards, and they are marked. They know exactly which ones are org standards by the way that they're kind of a code or a numbering system. And so I look at those once a year. And related to ROMA and reporting and so on, that's more on an ongoing as-needed basis. I have visited agencies to cover those things. We've done some things by phone. I've sent out email. I've sent out links to things from NASCAS, whatever I can do to help them know the changes in reporting and what their responsibilities will be.
Okay, thank you. Andy?
Yeah, so for going org standards, reporting, things like that, in the last year we really ramped up our use of webinars. So we trying to deliver kind of a webinar or a phone call. It's been webinars lately. Every 2 or 3 months, we'll kind of choose something that's pertinent to the season and have a short webinar with the grantees, with the staff at the grantees. With our standards monitoring, we haven't incorporated that into our site visit yet. We do a desk monitoring where we have them send examples of the documentation they're using for the standards. So that's kind of that ongoing. We do annually, but we do more of a desk audit for org standards.
Okay. All right, thanks. And Matt?
ROMA piece, I would say we do a monitoring, I wouldn't say, on ROMA. So what we would do is we review every year in the Community Action Plan the needs assessment and the strategic plan and give feedback on those two documents. Well, every year. If it hasn't been updated, then there might not be. But so we can give feedback in that period and the outcomes that come in that same community action plan. So we do that then. And we do a lot on training technical assistance around that piece, much more than on monitoring on the ROMA piece. So we just conducted a strategic planning training all day, training them regionally, and we've done on needs assessment. So we pick pieces that are involved in the ROMA cycle and do some kind of training around. So that's how we kind of handle ROMA. The piece around org standards, we did assessment of org standards, had documents uploaded into an online database, viewed those documents and assessed them for met or unmet, developed technical assistance plans based on results of that initial review. And so we have some agencies that still have some to meet, so they're still uploading documents. But in general, if you've met all the standards, then you don't upload additional things except for board minutes. But we still work with you on a training technical assistance plan towards what we call beyond compliance, which is basically just collaborative work between our agency and your agency to try to make better needs assessments and better strategic plannings. And like I said, we do trainings on those pieces, also in collaboration with our state association, so that it's improvement on the agency side. It's not compliant at that point. Most of our agencies are there now. They're at, they've met most of the standards, or all. Well, I won't say, 2/3 are at that point. So we'll work them differently, the ones that still have to meet standards, if that makes sense.
Yep. Oh, terrific. Thank you. And I see, Tracy, your hand is raised, and I think you're muted yourself because looks like you're muted, but you should be unmuted from our end. So if you can unmute yourself, then you could ask the question. If not, then you could type it into the chat window.
Hi, I'm Dunn from Washington State. And I was directing my question towards Matt. I was curious when you spoke about you go on site for monitoring, you separate out your visit to the board and do board interviews and attend the board meeting separately. My question is then, do you inform your monitoring report, or how do you inform your monitoring report for also that board visit or the board interviews, or do you even do that at all? So we include that as part of our monitoring report, so I was curious how that informs it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good question. So we do a separate letter for that. So a monitoring, and so we do this because board meetings are within, they're either every month or quarterly. So big gap between. We would schedule that within 1 to 2 months of the actual first monitoring visit. So you would have both letters within a 2-month period. But we do write separately. Good question.
Okay, much.
Thank you.
Is there any other questions? Again, you can ask or you can type in. Okay, any more questions? So you're still thinking, let me move. I realize I have a slide. So here you can see our upcoming best practices webinars. So our next one is going to be January 16th, where we'll be talking about the development of the state plan. Then January 22nd, the focus is going to be training and technical assistance. And we've combined the use of discretionary funds along with the distribution of funds. Those are two separate categories that were assessed through the ACSI, but we're putting them into one webinar, and that's our last one, and that's on January 29th. So I know if you haven't gotten links to these yet, so you haven't signed up because you haven't gotten the links, so we will be sending those links out to you. If not this week, then definitely next week to give you an opportunity to sign up for those. But these are the dates and the times. Are there any other questions? There is a question. This is specifically for Matt. So how do you incorporate seeing how the board interacts with the agency for, unquote, all things Roma when performing your monitoring review?
Have an interview with the board. In that interview, we do ask them a series of questions about how they interact with the processes involved at the agency that would be related to Roma. So, assessment, strategic plan, targeting of outcomes, reviewing at the end of the year the reports around outcomes, things like that. So we handle that in the interview piece. And I say that since that's kind of incorporated into our org standards with the documents that we have uploaded, we do do a review of board minutes, and so we will often send back questions. And I see it's also asked, is the ED present during the board interview? We prefer not.
Okay, all right, good. I thought you saw that one. Great. And there is another question, and this, if any of the three of you or all of you could answer, this is more general. Has there been any discussion about utilizing the organizational standards as the overall monitoring tool with perhaps incorporating a fiscal component?
Not considered that personally, only because I think our hope is that at some point we will have met the general standards and we will be looking at those things a lot less. I mean, I can see we org standards heavily into our monitoring tool. So I don't think it's, you know, I get the point, yes. But I haven't considered making it just org standards yet.
Okay, Kathy or Andy, do you have any want to comment on about that?
Kathy, and I did that 1 year. And as I said, I change it every year. I did that the first year. Actually, they're still in draft form. I went through them and really talked about each one in terms of what I was looking for and what they would need to be able to show me, and if they hadn't met it, that it would be that we're considering it to be best practice at that point in time, but that, you know, should the org standards be adopted, that it would be a requirement. And so I used it that way one time, but now I would say it's built into the document always, and probably another 40% of the questions are not org standard questions. They're related topics, but not those items.
Okay,
Yeah.
Did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I kind of echo both previous speaks too. I think a lot of what we do at the monitoring visit is more the programs and kind of to talk about what thing and what's working and why. A lot of those things don't come through necessarily in the org standards. So our monitoring visits are more about programs and goals, staffing, things like that.
Okay. I think that's it. And then we did get a comment that said from one of the participants that they, I think, agree with the three of you, that they don't think the organizational standards are as robust in content as performing an in-depth interview, which is what all of you were just saying. Doing program reviews, and this is a sort of a more general question as well. When doing programs review, do you review only those funded by CSBG?
So I can, we also have TANF funding in our state, so we have that. But I would say for certain pieces, it's only for CSBG in like reviewing information on eligibility and client files, things like that. But definitely have questions throughout the interview part that talk about other programs that are at the agency, and especially around some of those that are involved in targeting and that are related to Roma. So those touch on a lot more than just CSBG funded pieces.
Okay.
In Dakota, the record reviews are of cases that are funded at least in part by CSBG, but when we talk about strategic planning, when we talk about the risk assessment, when we talk about some of the other areas covered in the organizational standards, community needs assessment, those are much more broad-based than just programs funded CSBG, and so we do discuss those kinds of things. It's the record review that's specific.
Same in Minnesota as South Dakota. The more broad conversation is always about the link between the community and the kind of the strategy for meeting needs. There's not always CSBG related programming or funding.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Hey, I don't see any other questions coming through the chat window. So if you think of anything, we'll spend another couple minutes. But I just wanted to say that we received really good comments back from our first webinar. I happened to be on a call with a few state offices following that webinar, and they had very positive comments and were able to take away some things that they were able to implement within their state offices. So that's really the intent of the webinars, is for the states to share with you what they're doing, and then those are the things that you can think about, ways that you can implement exactly what you're hearing, or think about how you could implement that within your state office. So Kate, before, I don't see any other questions, but before we close, do you have something you'd like to share?
No, this has been a really good session. Yeah, best practices, continuous improvement. This is all about. So hopefully people have gotten good ideas, and we will be able to show continued improvement. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kate, and thank you also very much to Andy, Matt, and Kathy. That was a great presentation, and anybody feel free to reach out to them. I'm offering them up to all of you, and we will have the recording, and the slides will be in the Director's Digest that you'll get tomorrow. And thank you very much, and happy holidays to all of you who I won't speak to for the holidays. Thank you.